This presentation is on the concept of pure competition. As you know, we are analyzing the behavior of the individual firm. The firm's behavior is driven by the desire to maximize its profits, where profits are the difference between revenue and costs.
We've already covered the concept of costs. Here's what the short-run cost relationships look like. We covered costs first because these cost relationships apply to all firms, big or small. So, now we need to deal with the issue of revenue. The problem is that unlike the cost relationships, the revenue relationships are not standard across all firms. The revenue relationships will vary with the degree of competition.
Let's discuss the issue of competition. What it is. The varying degrees of competition. How it affects the revenue relationships. And, finally, what are the efficiency implications of the varying degrees of competition? Let's start by defining what competition is, in the microeconomics context. In English, competition means rivalry. There is rivalry among people, or firms, when things are scarce. There's not enough of something to satisfy all of their needs or wants. In economies, however, competition means something else. Competition refers to the degree in which market participants are influenced by the price mechanism. If the market participants in a particular industry are influenced only by the price mechanism, and no other factor will affect their decisions regarding how many units of the item to produce or consume, then this industry is perfectly competitive. Such an industry would be known as a purely competitive industry. What does a purely competitive industry look like? One where the only force influencing the behavior of market participants is the price mechanism. Let's list the characteristics, or we might call them, preconditions for pure competition. The first of these would be that the purely competitive industry must have many market participants, both buyers and sellers. But, what number separates many from few? There is no precise number. We might define many as having so many market participants that no one individual can have a significant impact on the market by his behavior. In other words, every firm must be a mere grain of sand on a vast beach of firms. That's a lot of firms. Let's consider how some factor, other than the price mechanism, might influence the behavior of market participants if this precondition were missing, for instance, if there were just a few sellers. One potential problem would be the possibility of collusion. To collude is to form an agreement, or to conspire. In this context, collusion would refer to an agreement among firms to not engage in mutually destructive price warfare. All the firms in the industry would agree to output restrictions, or price floors. The result would be that the price of whatever was being produced would not be determined by supply and demand, but rather by whatever the firms deemed to be in their own best interest. Collusive agreements are relatively easy to form, and to monitor when there are few market participants. However, if there were many sellers in the industry, collusive agreements, if they could be formed at all, would be unstable and likely dissolve very quickly. The temptations to cheat on the agreement would be too great, thus causing the agreement to fall apart. The probability of cheating increases with an increasing number of market participants. It's not always practical for an industry to be characterized by many sellers, especially those that are highly capital-intensive, such as the automobile manufacturing industry. However, there are laws on the books, known as antitrust legislation, that prohibits collusive agreements. A second potential problem that might arise if there were only a few sellers in the industry would be the creation of an artificial scarcity. In the case where there are so many sellers that the market cannot be affected by the actions of any one participant, as this first precondition requires, it would be impossible for one firm to control the market supply. Even if one of these many firms decided to produce 0 units of output, it would have virtually no impact on the market supply. However, when there are only a few sellers, one or more might produce a significant proportion of total market supply. By cutting output, some firm may very well be able to cause the market supply curve to shift to the left, thus causing the price of the good or service to rise. A rising price would mean rising profits for a firm who produced a good or service for which the demand was relatively inelastic. As you know, if price goes up, and the demand is inelastic, revenue also goes up. But a rising price would reduce quantity demanded, so the firm would produce fewer units, meaning production costs would go down. An increase in revenue, together with a decrease in production costs, causes profits to go up. A third problem, associated with the lack of this first precondition, many buyers and sellers, is the possible emergence of a price leader. A price leader is a firm that is able to dictate to the other firms in the industry the minimum price that they can charge. The price leader has this leverage because it has the deepest pockets. That is, if one firm does not adhere to the dictates of the price leader could lower its prices so low that it would take a loss. The only way the other firms in the industry could compete would be by matching these price cuts. The firm who could survive the losses for the longest period of time would then emerge as the monopolist, and could charge any price it wanted. So, if it wants to stay in business, no firm would dare try to undercut the price leader. In a purely competitive industry, where each market participant is an insignificant part of the whole, there could be no artificial scarcities or price leadership. No firm has pricing power. That's a Wall Street term for the ability of a firm to set prices. Pricing power gives the firm an opportunity to set prices and output at a point that will maximize its profits. The many buyers and sellers precondition implies that no firm has any pricing power. All firms, in a purely competitive industry, are price takers, not price setters. That is, they must charge the equilibrium market price. If they price their product lower than that, they are leaving some money on the table. If they set their prices higher, they will sell 0 units. There's always someone who will sell you the same product for less. The second precondition for pure competition is that there must be free and costless mobility of resources. Another way of saying this is that there must be no barriers that would prevent resources from entering into or exiting from an industry. In reality, this is not possible because virtually nothing is costless. However, any barriers that would impose a cost on or otherwise prevent resources from entering into or exiting from an industry would create allocative distortions in that industry. As a result, the barriers would create artificial shortages in one industry, the one in which there were barriers preventing entry of resources, resulting in an artificially high price, and artificial surpluses in another, one in which there were barriers preventing resources from exiting an industry, resulting in an artificially low price. The price mechanism, because of these supply distortions, would not be representative of the true value that society placed upon a good or service. As a result, the barriers would create artificial shortages in one industry, the one in which there were barriers preventing entry of resources, resulting in an artificially high price, and artificial surpluses in another, one in which there were barriers preventing resources from exiting an industry, resulting in an artificially low price. The price mechanism, because of these supply distortions, would not be representative of the true value that society placed upon a good or service. Let's consider the types of barriers to the free mobility of resources that may be present in an industry. One such barrier would be posed by the huge financial requirements needed to become an economy of scale in capital-intensive industries. We could call these financial barriers. A firm that used a labor-intensive process to produce a good or service would not likely face prohibitive financial barriers. As you may recall from the section on production costs, labor-intensive firms become economies of scale at small sizes. Plumbing, real estate, and bookkeeping services, for example, are highly labor-intensive. Although they do use capital equipment, the capital expenditure requirements are small and would not pose significant barriers. Capital-intensive firms, however, become economies of scale at high levels of output. Imagine, for example, an automobile or airplane manufacturing firm producing on a small scale. These goods require a highly capital-intensive production process. Therefore, billions of dollars of capital are required before such a firm could even produce its first unit of output. Those billions of dollars required just to produce the first unit of output would then pose a financial barrier to entry. Potential entrepreneurs could not rush into the industry, chasing economic profits. Most would find it difficult, if not impossible, to raise $1 billion. A second type of barrier, preventing or otherwise hindering resources from entering an industry, we could call natural barriers. Natural barriers exist when an industry is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is an industry where it is more efficient to have one producer rather than a lot of competing producers. That is, Competition results in less efficiency when an industry is a natural monopoly. Natural monopolies can exist for a variety of reasons. The most common reason is where the sale or distribution of the product requires a unique investment in each potential consumer. An electric utility is an example of a natural monopoly. Each potential customer would require his own wired connection to the electric company. If the customer did not use it, it could not be used by any other customer. The connection is unique to that one customer. If there were two electric companies, each potential customer would require his own connection to that second company as well. Where you see one outlet on the wall now, if there were two companies, you'd see two, each connected to the provider. We could assume that on any given day, the consumer would choose to use the services provided by the company charging the lowest price. But that would mean that the infrastructure connecting the consumer to the other company would lie idle, because it could not be used by another customer. This would be an inefficient use of resources. If there were 3 providers of electricity, 2 sets of wires would always be lying idle. 4 companies, 3 sets lying idle, etc. To avoid this wasteful squandering of resources, we allow all of the output to be provided by a single seller, a monopoly. Long-distance phone service was once considered a natural monopoly. That's because the signals were transmitted by wires, so an infrastructure similar to the electric utility company was required for each potential consumer. However, now, with cell phones, long-distance services are transmitted by RF waves, not wires, so a unique infrastructure for each potential consumer is no longer required. You can purchase long-distance phone services from a variety of providers. That industry is no longer a natural monopoly. Because competition is not regulating the behavior of the natural monopolist, the government does it. The government sets price limits, output minimums, and other parameters by which the natural monopolist must abide. The government sets these requirements so that the customer receives a fair deal, and the natural monopolist makes a fair profit. Another type of barrier to entry would be legal barriers. Legal barriers are actually imposed by the government. Although the government wants to encourage competition within industries, in certain cases it deems that the benefits of imposing these barriers outweigh the efficiency losses due to a lack of competition. Legal barriers would include licenses, permits, patents, and copyrights. Licenses and permits are used to regulate the sale and/or use of goods. Patents and copyrights motivate creativity and progress. The enticing vision of economic profits that could not be competed away by other producers stealing your idea may motivate people to invent or create something. If I get a patent on a nuclear-powered circ-making machine that I invented, you cannot enter that industry and produce it yourself, despite the fact that I may be making huge economic profits, not until a specified period of time has elapsed anyway. Copyrights prevent theft of intellectual property. If I write the best microeconomics book ever, you cannot copy and sell it, even though I may be making money hand over fist.
The third precondition for pure competition is the requirement that all the products produced within a particular industry be homogeneous. Homogeneous means alike, or the same. If all the products were exactly the same, such as, say, salt, or honey, or BBs for a BB gun, the consumer would purchase from the producer who charged him the lowest price. No other factor would influence the behavior of the consumer, and that's what pure competition is all about. But how alike must the products be? After all, no 2 things are identical down to their last molecule. In order for the price mechanism to be the only influencing factor, the products must be so alike that the consumer is indifferent as to his source of purchase. That is, the consumer doesn't care which brand he buys, he'll just buy the one with the lowest price. But firms don't really want to compete with each other on the basis of price. Price warfare is mutually destructive. They'd like to find some other way to motivate the consumer to buy their product without having to slash prices. One way they can do this is through advertising. By advertising, a firm attempts to convince a consumer that its product is somehow significantly better than its competitor's product. This difference may be real or imagined. If the advertising works, the consumer will buy the firm's product even though it may not be the least expensive product in the industry. As a result, the price mechanism's effect on consumers' behavior is diluted as the consumer begins to respond to other forces. But, it would be wrong to conclude that advertising is a total drag on the efficiency of the economy. We could divide advertising into 2 basic types: persuasive and informative. One can argue that persuasive advertising is an inefficient use of society's scarce resources. Its purpose is to merely redistribute customers among firms in an industry. Informative advertising, on the other hand, is an efficient use of resources because it saves the customer the cost of having to search out information about product availability, price, functionality, and so on. In reality, most advertising is probably some combination of the two. Additionally, the drive by a firm to differentiate its product in order to avoid pure price competition could motivate the firm to invest resources in making cosmetic or other incidental and insignificant variations. In the 1950s and early 60s, for example, automobile manufacturers used to put tail fins on cars. Ralph Lauren products are known for their widely recognizable polo player. It's not unusual for a customer to pay $50 extra for a shirt with a polo player embroidered on the chest. On the other hand, the drive to differentiate the product might motivate the firm to make real and significant functional differences. In the early days of the automobile, you had to crank the engine manually to get it started. Automobile manufacturers were able to distinguish their produce from all the others in the industry by adding electric ignitions. In the early days of the automobile, flat tires were very common. Today, however, the steel-belted, self-sealing radial tires can easily go 70,000 miles or more without a single flat. The list of these innovations go on and on: automatic transmissions, V8 engines, air conditioning, modern suspension systems, satellite radio, and now, the all-electric vehicle. Each of these innovations were initially implemented so the firm could compete for the patronage of the consumer on some basis other than price. If the innovations by one firm proved popular, all of the other firms had to scramble to do the same so they could keep up with the competition. But whether the differences are real or cosmetic, would we really want industries to offer homogeneous products? It would force firms to respond strictly and exclusively to the price mechanism, but would we not want choices among a variety of options? Would we want everyone as society, for example, to walk around all day in mouse suits? There is one more precondition for pure competition. Each market participant must have complete and perfect knowledge about all aspects of the market. As unrealistic as it may seem, it is required so that no consumer can be fooled into making an irrational decision because of ignorance of the market, and all firms are aware of latest state-of-the-art technology.
If a consumer or a firm acted randomly, as it might if it lacked market knowledge, it would not be responding to the signals of the price mechanism.
So this is what a perfectly competitive market looks like. As you might guess, these requirements are very unrealistic, but they provide a hypothetical extreme so we can have a basis for assessing more realistic markets.
We've answered this question. We now know what competition is. We now need to consider the varying degrees of competition. Let's start by envisioning a continuum of competition. Our starting point will be the extreme case of pure competition. This, of course, is where all of the preconditions are present. It is highly unrealistic. Perhaps the closest we can come in real life is the agriculture industry. You can't tell which farmer or agri-corporation grew that ear of corn you had at your cookout last weekend. They're indistinguishable, one from another. There are many farmers producing corn. Although there may be some barriers to entry into the industry now that farms have become more mechanized and capital intensive. But everybody pretty much knows what an ear of corn is. At the other extreme is the polar opposite of pure competition, pure monopoly. Monopoly means one seller. A single seller in an industry faces no competition because no firm is selling a good or service that consumers consider a substitute. But, how did the monopolist become a monopoly? Probably because there are insurmountable and impenetrable barriers to entry, whether financial, natural, or legal. Both the preconditions of homogeneity of the products and perfect knowledge, in the case of a monopoly, are moot. We use the term pure monopoly here, rather than just monopoly, because in reality, if a real-life monopoly actually existed, the government would not let it operate unregulated. The government would use its antitrust laws to impose restrictions and regulations to prevent it from taking unfair advantage of consumers. The term, pure, in this context, indicates that the firm is unregulated and is free to grope up and down the demand curve to find that price and output combination that would maximize its profits. It is a price setter, not a price taker, as is the perfectly competitive firm. A pure monopoly is almost as unrealistic as a perfectly competitive firm. We use it, however, in the same way we use pure competition, as an extreme that we can use as a standard by which we can evaluate more realistic market models. Now, let's consider more realistic market models. The next stop along our continuum is a market that has many sellers and buyers, and no barriers to entry. Sounds pretty competitive, right? But in this case, the products are not homogeneous. They are differentiated, either because there are physical differences that the consumer values or because of his market ignorance, he believes one good to be significantly better than the others in the industry. That is, preconditions 1 and 2 hold, but preconditions 3 and 4 break down. If you were to tell me that you had to miss class because you had to go buy a pair of sneakers, I'd say, okay then, you're buying from a pretty competitive firm because there are a lot of sneaker manufacturers out there. But if you told me that you were going to buy a pair of Nikes, I'd say that you were buying from a monopolist. That's because there's only one producer of Nikes. That would be Nike. So in one sense, by virtue of the fact that there are many manufacturers of sneakers, the industry is competitive. Because the products are heterogeneous, not homogeneous, and you prefer one brand over all the rest, you're going to buy a product produced by a single firm. So, in that sense, the industry, as far as you're concerned, is a monopoly. Therefore, we call such an industry monopolistic competition. Our final stop along this continuum of competition is a situation where there are few, rather than many, firms, although more than one firm. Recall that we define the characteristic of many sellers as such a large number of firms that no individual firm, by its own actions, has the power to affect or influence the market in any way. For an industry with few sellers, therefore, at least some of the firms in the industry would be a large and significant part of the market. So large, in fact, that its actions, say, increasing or lowering its price or level of output, would send reverberations throughout the industry. Such an industry we will call oligopoly. Like the word oligarchy, which means few rulers, the word oligopoly means few sellers. Here, we're talking about industries consisting of huge capital-intensive industries like big auto, big steel, big rail, big oil, as well as wireless carriers and tire manufacturers. These huge firms are so capital-intensive that they become economies of scale at very large sizes and quantities of output. There's only room in such an industry for a few firms. Recall that we first talked about production costs because the cost relationships were the very same for all firms, irrespective of the degree of competition or the firm size. It was the revenue relationships that changed from firm to firm. And, as was pointed out, the main factor that caused the relationships to vary was the degree of competition that the firm faced. So, we asked, what is competition? And what does a competitive industry look like? Now we must consider how varying degrees of competition will affect the revenue relationships. We will take up this issue in the next video.